There's a particular kind of frustration that comes with menopause that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. It's not just the hot flashes, or the night sweats, or the mood shifts. It's the sense that your own body has changed the rules without giving you a manual to deal with it. For decades, women have largely been left to either tough it out silently or turn to hormone therapy, which works well for many people but isn't the right fit for everyone, whether due to personal health history, personal preference, or simply wanting to try gentler options first. In that gap, a quieter category of research has been growing steadily for years, focused on something most people already have sitting in their kitchen cabinets: spices. This isn't a story about miracle cures or about replacing medical treatment. It's a story about what actual clinical trials, real studies involving real women, have found when researchers tested specific spices against the symptoms that define the menopausal transition. And 3 spices in particular have accumulated enough research attention to be worth a genuinely serious conversation: fenugreek, fennel, and sage. Let's start with some basic biology, because understanding why spices might matter here requires understanding what's actually happening during menopause in the first place. As women approach menopause, the ovaries gradually produce less estrogen. This isn't a smooth, gradual decline for everyone. For many women, it's an uneven, sometimes dramatic drop that affects multiple body systems simultaneously. Estrogen interacts with receptors throughout the body, not just in reproductive tissue, but in the brain's temperature regulation centers, in bone tissue, in blood vessels, and in mood-regulating neural pathways. When estrogen drops, all of these systems can be affected, which is part of why menopause symptoms are so varied. Hot flashes and night sweats from temperature dysregulation, mood changes and brain fog from effects on neurotransmitter systems, joint discomfort, sleep disruption, and changes in vaginal and urogenital tissue. This is where the idea of phytoestrogens becomes relevant. Phytoestrogens are plant compounds that have a chemical structure similar enough to human estrogen that they can bind to some of the same receptors in the body, although typically with much weaker effects than the body's own estrogen. The theory behind using certain herbs and spices for menopause symptoms is that these plant compounds might partially compensate for declining estrogen levels by gently activating some of the same receptors that estrogen normally would, potentially easing some of the downstream symptoms without introducing the same risks associated with hormone replacement therapy. Let's start with fenugreek because it has, by a meaningful margin, the strongest body of clinical research behind it among common kitchen spices when it comes to menopause specifically. Fenugreek is a small, slightly bitter seed widely used in Indian, Middle Eastern, and North African cooking, often toasted and added to curries, lentil dishes, and spice blends. Beyond the kitchen, fenugreek has a long history in traditional medicine systems, and in more recent years, it's become a genuine subject of randomized, placebo-controlled clinical research, which is the gold standard for testing whether something actually works rather than simply seeming to work. Several studies have specifically tested fenugreek seed extract in postmenopausal and perimenopausal women. One randomized, double-blinded, placebo-controlled study involving postmenopausal women found that those given a fenugreek seed extract experienced significant reductions in hot flashes, night sweats, and pain in leg muscles and joints, along with improvements in irritability and vaginal dryness when compared to women given a placebo. Another separate randomized trial, this one focused specifically on perimenopausal women, found meaningful improvement across multiple categories of discomfort, including measurable reductions in the frequency and severity of hot flashes and night sweats, along with improvements in measures of depression and insomnia, again compared against a placebo group. It's worth being precise about what these studies actually measured, because precision matters more than vague claims. In one of the more detailed studies, researchers found multiple-fold reductions in the frequency of hot flashes, night sweats, and joint and muscle pain among women taking the fenugreek extract compared to those on placebo, alongside meaningful improvements in irritability and vaginal dryness scores. These aren't small or marginal differences. They represent some of the more compelling results seen in herbal menopause research to date. That said, intellectual honesty requires a caveat here. Most of these clinical trials used standardized, concentrated fenugreek extracts rather than plain fenugreek powder or whole seeds as you'd find in your spice cabinet. And several were funded by companies that manufacture these specific extracts, which is a financial conflict of interest worth being aware of, even when the underlying science appears methodologically sound. Some researchers who've reviewed this body of literature more broadly have noted that culinary-grade fenugreek powder, used at a dose of around 1.5 teaspoons daily, appears to produce comparable benefits in available research, which is encouraging for anyone who'd rather use the actual spice from their kitchen than purchase a specific branded supplement. Still, the bulk of the most rigorous, peer-reviewed evidence centers on standardized extracts, and that distinction matters for anyone trying to set realistic expectations. Now let's talk about fennel, a spice that often gets less attention than fenugreek, but that has its own increasingly interesting research base. Fennel seeds, those small, slightly sweet anise-flavored seeds often used in Mediterranean and South Asian cooking, contain phytoestrogen compounds, and several clinical trials have specifically tested fennel extract against menopausal symptoms. The research on fennel has generally focused on similar outcome measures as the fenugreek studies: frequency of hot flashes, severity of night sweats, and overall quality of life scores during the menopausal transition. Researchers in this area have generally concluded that fennel appears to be an effective and reasonably safe option for reducing menopausal symptoms, based on the trials conducted so far, though as with most botanical research in this space, the total number of high-quality trials remains smaller than what exists for pharmaceutical treatments, meaning the evidence, while promising, is still considered preliminary by the standards typically applied to mainstream medical treatments. One particularly interesting detail about fennel is that its mechanism may not be limited purely to phytoestrogen activity. Some research has explored fennel's broader anti-inflammatory and antispasmodic properties, which are part of why it's traditionally been used for digestive discomfort as well. Whether these broader properties contribute meaningfully to its effects on menopausal symptoms specifically, separate from its phytoestrogen content, isn't entirely clear yet. But it does suggest fennel might be working through more than one pathway simultaneously, which is a reasonable hypothesis for why it shows benefit, even though it's a milder phytoestrogen source than some other options. Now, sage. This is perhaps the most surprising entry on this list for many people, since sage is more commonly associated with holiday cooking and savory dishes than with hormone health. But sage has a long traditional use specifically for excessive sweating, and that traditional use has led researchers to test it specifically against hot flashes and night sweats in menopausal women. One notable study examined a group of postmenopausal women, generally in their late 40s to late 50s, given a fresh sage extract over the course of roughly 2 months. The results showed meaningful reductions in the number and severity of hot flashes, along with improvements in mood-related symptoms and what's sometimes described as mental fog, a commonly reported but often dismissed symptom of the menopausal transition. What stood out in this particular research was how quickly some women reported noticing a difference, with benefits appearing within the first month of consistent use for some participants, rather than requiring many months before any change was noticeable. Sage's proposed mechanism is a little different from fenugreek and fennel. Rather than relying primarily on phytoestrogen activity, sage appears to have a more direct effect on body temperature regulation and on sweat gland activity, possibly through its interaction with the body's cholinergic system, which plays a role in regulating sweating. This is worth noting because it suggests sage might be working through a genuinely different biological pathway than fenugreek or fennel, which raises the interesting possibility that combining spices targeting different mechanisms rather than relying on just one might offer more comprehensive symptom relief than any single spice alone. Although this specific idea of deliberately combining them hasn't been rigorously tested in controlled trials and remains more of a logical inference than an established finding. Let's talk practically now, because knowing the research is only useful if you can translate it into something you'd actually do at home. For fenugreek, a reasonable starting approach based on available research would be incorporating ground fenugreek seeds into cooking, toasting them lightly to bring out their flavor and reduce bitterness, and adding them to lentil dishes, curries, or even into homemade spice blends. For those who find the taste too strong or bitter on its own, fenugreek pairs well with warming spices like cumin and turmeric in savory dishes. If using it more deliberately and consistently, aiming for roughly a teaspoon to a teaspoon and a half daily, taken consistently over a period of at least 4 to 6 weeks, aligns reasonably well with the timeframes used in the available clinical research, since most of these studies didn't see their full effects within just a few days, but rather after weeks of consistent use. For fennel, the seeds can be chewed directly after meals, a traditional practice in many South Asian households already, brewed into a tea by steeping crushed seeds in hot water for several minutes, or incorporated into cooking, particularly in dishes with a Mediterranean or South Asian flavor profile. Fennel tea specifically has become a popular and accessible way to incorporate a consistent daily dose without needing to significantly change cooking habits. For sage, brewing it as a tea is probably the most practical at-home approach, since sage isn't typically used in large culinary quantities the way fenugreek or fennel might be. Fresh or dried sage leaves steeped in hot water for several minutes produce a tea with an earthy, slightly peppery, lemony undertone. Alternatively, sage can be chopped and incorporated into savory cooking, sautéed with vegetables or mixed into grain dishes, though achieving a therapeutic dose through cooking alone is somewhat less precise than through a brewed tea or standardized extract. It's worth being clear about something important here. These spices aren't meant to replace medical evaluation, especially for women experiencing severe or significantly disruptive menopausal symptoms. Hormone replacement therapy remains, according to current medical guidance, the most effective treatment for moderate to severe vasomotor symptoms like hot flashes and night sweats, and it should remain on the table as an option to discuss with a doctor, particularly for women whose quality of life is significantly affected. These spices may be a reasonable complementary approach, or a starting point for women looking for gentler options before considering hormone therapy, or an addition for women who are already on hormone therapy but still experiencing residual symptoms. But they shouldn't be framed as a wholesale replacement for appropriate medical care when symptoms are severe. It's also worth flagging some safety considerations, since natural doesn't automatically mean risk-free. Fenugreek has documented blood sugar lowering effects, which is generally a positive finding for people managing blood sugar, but it does mean anyone taking diabetes medication should discuss fenugreek use with their doctor, since combining the two could potentially push blood sugar lower than intended. Fenugreek has also occasionally been associated with mild digestive upset in some users, particularly at higher doses. Fennel is generally considered to have a strong safety profile in food-level amounts, though very high concentrated doses haven't been as extensively studied for long-term safety. Sage, particularly certain varieties high in a compound called thujoni, should be used in moderate amounts, since very high doses of concentrated sage extract over extended periods have raised some safety questions in research, though typical culinary and tea-level use is generally considered safe for most people. Anyone with a history of hormone-sensitive conditions, including certain types of breast cancer, should have a specific conversation with their oncologist or doctor before significantly increasing intake of any phytoestrogen-containing herb or spice, since the interaction between plant-based estrogen-like compounds and hormone-sensitive conditions is an area where individualized medical guidance matters considerably more than general population research. There's something worth appreciating about this whole area of research, beyond just the specific findings. For a long time, menopause was a chronically understudied area of medicine, often treated as something women should simply endure quietly, rather than something deserving the same rigorous clinical research attention given to other major life transitions and health conditions. The fact that randomized, placebo-controlled trials now exist specifically testing kitchen spices against hot flashes and night sweats represents a meaningful shift in how seriously this stage of life is being taken by the broader research community, even if there's still a long way to go before this body of evidence reaches the depth and consistency we'd want. Let's spend some more time on the practical side of actually working these spices into daily life, because knowing the research only matters if it translates into a habit you can sustain. One approach many women have found workable is building a single daily ritual around these spices rather than trying to scatter them randomly throughout meals. For example, Brewing a single cup of combined fennel and sage tea in the morning, using roughly a teaspoon each of crushed fennel seed and dried sage leaf steeped together in hot water for around 8 to 10 minutes, creates a single, repeatable habit rather than 3 separate things to remember throughout the day. Fenugreek, given its stronger and more bitter flavor profile, often works better folded into a savory meal rather than a tea, particularly toasted lightly in a dry pan for a minute or two before grinding, which mellows some of its bitterness and brings out a more pleasant, slightly maple-like aroma. It's also worth talking about realistic timelines for noticing change, since this is one of the most common points of confusion and disappointment when people try natural approaches without understanding how the research itself was structured. None of the clinical trials discussed here found dramatic, overnight relief. The fenugreek studies generally measured outcomes over 6 weeks. The fennel studies often ran 8 to 10 weeks, and the sage research showed some participants noticing change within a month, but continued to show improvement through the second month of consistent use. This pattern, gradual and cumulative rather than immediate, is fairly typical of how plant-based compounds tend to work in the body compared to pharmaceutical interventions, which are often specifically engineered for faster, more dramatic onset. Setting expectations around a 6 to 8 week trial period, used consistently every day rather than sporadically, gives any of these spices a fair and realistic chance to show whether they're making a meaningful difference for your particular body. It's also genuinely worth discussing why individual responses to these spices vary so much from person to person, since this comes up constantly in discussions about herbal approaches to menopause. Part of the answer lies in genetic variation in how individuals metabolize and respond to phytoestrogen compounds. Certain gut bacteria, for instance, are specifically able to convert some plant compounds, particularly certain isoflavones found in foods like soy, into more biologically active forms. Not everyone's gut microbiome contains these specific converting bacteria in meaningful amounts, which may partly explain why some women report dramatic relief from phytoestrogen-rich foods and herbs, while others notice little to no difference despite using the exact same approach consistently. This isn't a reason to give up on trying these options, but it is a reason to manage expectations and to recognize that what works powerfully for one person may simply not translate the same way for another, through no fault of how diligently either person follows the approach. Age and stage of menopause also appear to play a role in how women respond to these botanical approaches, based on patterns observed across different trials. Some research suggests that women earlier in the perimenopausal transition, when hormone fluctuations tend to be more erratic but baseline estrogen levels haven't dropped as completely as in later postmenopause, may respond somewhat differently to phytoestrogen-containing herbs compared to women many years past their final period, when estrogen levels have stabilized at a consistently lower baseline. This is still an evolving area of research rather than a settled finding, but it's a reasonable part of why one woman's experience with these spices, shared anecdotally, may not perfectly predict another woman's experience, even when both are broadly within the menopausal transition. Diet and lifestyle factors surrounding these spices matter too, and shouldn't be overlooked just because the spotlight tends to land on the spice itself. Alcohol, caffeine, and spicy foods are well-documented common triggers that can worsen hot flashes and night sweats for many women, meaning that adding fenugreek, fennel, or sage to a diet that's otherwise heavy in these triggers may produce a much less noticeable benefit than adding the same spices to a diet where common triggers have already been moderated. Similarly, stress management. Since cortisol and the body's broader stress response system interact with the same hypothalamic temperature regulation centers affected by declining estrogen, appears in various research to influence the frequency and severity of hot flashes independently of diet. None of this means spices won't help on their own, but it does suggest that pairing them with broader lifestyle awareness, reducing common triggers, and managing stress where possible likely improves the odds of noticing a meaningful benefit. Sleep deserves specific mention here too, since the relationship between menopause symptoms and sleep quality often becomes a frustrating cycle that's worth naming directly. Night sweats disrupt sleep, and poor sleep itself appears to worsen next-day symptoms, including mood disturbances and even the perceived severity of hot flashes during waking hours, creating a loop that can feel difficult to break. Some women have found that incorporating sage tea specifically in the evening, given its traditional association with reducing sweating, alongside basic sleep hygiene practices like keeping the bedroom cool and avoiding screens before bed, provides a more complete approach to interrupting this particular cycle than addressing daytime symptoms and nighttime symptoms as entirely separate problems.